I think both these teams will ultimately end up in the college football playoff, and I think they will occupy at least 2 of the maybe 4 spots the SEC is possibly going to get when the playoff is unveiled there at the beginning of December. Hello and welcome. It's always college football. I'm Greg McElroy. Thanks for being with us today. It is Thursday, May 16th. We hope that you're enjoying the show wherever it is you're getting the show. Whether it's on Spotify, the Apple Podcast platform, or if you're here with us via the ESPN YouTube channel, thanks for being here. It's a lot of fun talking ball this time of year. May is a little slow. The portal is slowed down, so we're starting to kind of stop looking back, if you will. We're not looking back as much as we are looking forward at this point of the year. We'll start to visit with coaches. We've already had Matt Rule on. We'll have Mike Gundy on. We have several other coaches lined up here in the next few weeks to kind of help dive into where the team is going and where they are right now in the world of college football. So what we're going to do today is something we did actually a couple weeks ago. We're going to go through the Power 4 conferences. We're going to pick 2 teams with comparable expectations based on what Vegas thinks. So teams that have the same win total in Vegas, and we'll go through their schedules. We'll talk a little bit about what they have from a personnel standpoint. Maybe there's turnover within the coaching staff. Maybe there's a new coordinator. Maybe there's a big, highly regarded prospect that could be stepping up for those particular schools. So we'll dive into some teams that have comparable expectations, and we'll go through their schedule. We'll go through some storylines, and we'll talk about which team at the moment we might feel better about. We also will take some questions in the mailbag. All right. So a lot that we really need to look forward to and a lot that we got to get to. So let's dive in. Some comparable expectation teams and how they kind of stack up against each other. Let's start in the SEC. And this year, it's kind of strange to think that Vegas has comparable expectations for both Ole Miss and Alabama, just based on the trajectory, the historical significance, recent history. All those things would indicate that these teams are not necessarily playing at the same level, but Vegas has the win total for both the Tide and the Rebels at 9.5. We'll start with Ole Miss. Now, Lane Kiffin has certainly embraced the current state of college football, whether it's the portal, being outspoken about the portal, being very active in social media, altering how he's kind of handling the spring game. I mean, he's done an awful lot to kind of really make Ole Miss kind of a destination program. He's done a great job of making them a team that has been really attractive in the portal, gone out and got high quality talent, blue chip prospects in some cases. And he brings back a lot of really good players off a team that won 11 games last year. They've been to multiple New Year's Six bowl games, but this is the first year where it really feels like coming into the season, it feels a little bit for Ole Miss like it's playoff or bust. So with the additions of Logan Diggs and Henry Parrish, with the additions of Princely Manuelin on the edge defensively, bringing in Walter Nolan, one of the top defensive tackles, a bunch of other players at really all 3 levels defensively, and a couple weapons there on the offensive side, including Juice Wells from South Carolina. A lot of people seem to think this team is destined for the playoff. Part of the reason why I think so many people are bullish on them is their schedule feels manageable. They'll start with Furman. That's a win. Middle Tennessee, that's a win. They'll go to Wake Forest. Fairly manageable road trip there in the non-conference. They'll get Georgia Southern at home. There's really no reason why Ole Miss shouldn't start the season at least 4-0. Then they'll get Kentucky at home, be a tricky game. At South Carolina, very tricky game. At LSU, very tricky game. Oklahoma comes to them on October 26th. They're at Arkansas. They have Georgia at home, and they're at Florida, and they finally finish the season with the Egg Bowl. So the way we've done this in the past, kind of going through what games are losable, okay? We know the automatic wins, okay? Furman, Middle Tennessee, Georgia Southern. Granted, could they lose one of those? Sure. Anything's possible, but let's just give it to them for the process of this exercise. Let's just not waste time debating whether or not they're going to beat Furman, okay? So let's give them a 4-0 start, including a win on the road at Wake Forest. I do think the Kentucky game is losable. I think at South Carolina is losable. I think at LSU is losable. Anytime you're on the road in the SEC, it's very tricky. And if there's one thing we've learned about Lane Kiffin is there are occasional mishaps and where the team doesn't play real well. They kind of do elevate and in some cases lower themselves to the level of the competition. I hope that's not the case this year, because they are significantly more talented than some of the teams on their roster. But I'm not going to necessarily think they're going to go to Arkansas and give up the rushing yards they gave up a couple years ago. Is that game losable? Perhaps. But I don't think they lose that one, not this year, not with what happened 2 years ago on their last trip to Fayetteville. At Florida, I think the tricky one. Mississippi State's a tricky one. We know the Georgia game's really tough as well. Oklahoma at home. So a lot of games I think that are losable, but I think there's really about 5 that are legitimately losable. And I'm not saying they lose all 5. I think they probably win 4 of the 5 in some cases, maybe 3 of the 5 in some cases. 10-2, the Ole Miss Rebels probably not in the SEC championship, but more than likely en route to the college football playoff. Just a matter of who those losses come to. But you look at the schedule, it lays out pretty nicely for Ole Miss. We'll look at Alabama. A lot of change here in the offseason for the Crimson Tide. Kalen DeBoer is in. Obviously, a lot of guys entered the portal there the first time around, but the second time around, not so much. They've been able to go out and attract some veterans, some guys in the secondary, which was a position of need, a guy or two along the offensive line, which was a position of need. So they've gotten a little bit older here in this most recent go-round in the portal. They also, I think, have added immediate difference makers in Parker Brailsford, the offensive lineman, center transfer from Washington. Caden Proctor transfers back from Iowa after he left this there in December. He should be in a good spot to lock down the starting spot. You look at LT Overton from Texas A&M. They're really pleased with what he's done at defensive end. And then Keon Sabb at safety to help kind of fortify the loss that was Caleb Downs. They've done a really good job in the portal. Now, Bama is a little thinner than they've been in the past, but the frontline talent is as good as it's ever been. And some of the backups and the guys that will be playing maybe minimized roles, extremely talented, just young. And in some cases on defense, particularly at corner, maybe at nickel, those guys might be true freshmen. 5 stars, but true freshmen nonetheless. Jalen Milroe is back, and in this offense, I think he has a chance to really take off. But they're going to, I would imagine, showcase some of his running skills, which they didn't use quite as much as last year. So we'll be curious to see whether or not it's a fully unleashed Jalen Milroe as he heads into year 2 as a starter. Let's go through the schedule. Western Kentucky, South Florida, at Wisconsin. 3, I think, good, solid non-conference opponents. I think Western Kentucky's a bowl team. I think South Florida's a bowl team. I think Wisconsin's a bowl team this year. And you go to Camp Randall there on September 14th. Georgia comes to you after that. That'll be a very difficult game. Of course, it's a losable one naturally. It's Bama, Georgia. It's 2 of the best programs in the sport. So that game is a toss-up for sure, even though it's there in Bryant-Denny. At Vanderbilt, that should be one they handle. South Carolina comes to them. That's one that they should handle. So at worst for Bama, you're looking at a 5-1 start. At worst, potentially 6-0, very much within the realm of possibility. But down the stretch is where it gets much more difficult. 3rd Saturday in October at Tennessee. Missouri comes to them after that. I do think Alabama matches up pretty well against Missouri. Granted, Missouri's got a good passing attack, excellent wide receiver core, but I do think they match up pretty well offensively against a defense that I think does have some question marks coming into the season. That game is in Bryant-Denny, but it is certainly a losable one if they don't play well. At LSU, of course, a very difficult game, one that is always a toss-up there for the Crimson Tide. They're at Oklahoma on November 23rd, and they are against Auburn at home. They're on the final weekend of the season. You look at it, how many games are losable? I mean, 5, perhaps. How many do you really think they're going to lose? Man, I have a hard time thinking that Alabama's going to lose once, maybe twice on their home field this year. I just don't see it. Whether they get Georgia, whether they get Missouri, whether they get Auburn, I just don't think it's likely that they're going to lose multiple games on their home field. They might lose one, but I can't imagine them losing multiple. Now, on the road at Tennessee, extremely difficult game. On the road at LSU, very difficult game. And that road trip to Oklahoma right before the Iron Bowl, also very challenging. But I think Bama right now is a little bit ahead of Oklahoma there, especially if they go on the road. So right now, based on the win total that is presented to us between Ole Miss and Alabama, I would lean just ever so slightly in favor of Alabama. But at the same time, I think Ole Miss is right there. I think both these teams will ultimately end up in the college football playoff, and I think they will occupy at least 2 of the maybe 4 spots the SEC is possibly going to get when the playoff is unveiled there at the beginning of December. Let's move to the Big 12. 2 teams with really high expectations. I think at least one of these 2 teams has a real good chance of getting to the college football playoff. Now, the game on September 21st might ultimately determine which of these 2 teams is in the mix for that playoff spot. But let's do Utah and let's do Kansas State. Vegas very bullish on both. Utah and Kansas State coming in with a 9.5 win total coming into the season. You look at what Utah has. Utah, considering what they have back with Cam Rising, you have a great running back in Micah Bernard. You got Brant Keithy back at tight end. You add a playmaker in Dorian Singer. You got a great coach in Kyle Whittingham that does have to replace a couple key pieces in the back end defensively. But if you look at Utah, they're always going to be really stout and really good at all three levels on that side of the ball. Offensively, though, I think in this league, they're probably going to have to score more points. But I think they're capable of doing it, knowing some of the weapons and the veteran presence that they have there with Cam Rising's return. You actually look at the schedule. And the schedule to me is extremely manageable for Utah, especially understanding what league they're coming from. And you know the respect that I had for the Pac-12 the last couple of years. There is no Washington on the schedule. There is no Oregon on the schedule. There is no SC on the schedule. So it does feel a little bit more manageable for Utah as they transition to a new league. You go through the schedule, and there's just not that many games that they are going to likely be in a toss-up scenario. You got Southern Utah, Baylor at home, Utah State on the road in the first 3 weeks of the season. I think Baylor coming to them is advantage Utes all day and twice on Saturday. So I'm going to lean in favor of the Utes there in that game. So I think they get off to a 3-0 start. Arguably the most difficult game on the schedule is September 21st. That's on the road at Oklahoma State. That game, extremely difficult. We know what Oklahoma State brings back. We know that Oklahoma State can pound the football. Are you going to be able to run the ball real well against Utah? Probably not. They've always been very stout against the run. But at the same time, I do think the weapons for Oklahoma State will pose a bit of a challenge on somewhat of a retooled secondary, especially there at the safety spot. Arizona comes to Utah. I think Arizona, expectations are high. I am not quite as bullish on Arizona as everybody else is. And the fact that it's at Utah, I think it's a game they should win. But is it losable? Sure, you could certainly make a case for that. Arizona State, I think they're still at least a year away. TCU comes to them. I would lean in favor of Utah in that game. At Houston, I would lean in favor of Utah there. BYU comes to them. I think they will get BYU next year. They're in the holy war between Utah and BYU. That game will be played there in Salt Lake. Colorado's on the road. I think Utah in the trenches will have a significant advantage over Colorado. Now, Colorado, maybe they can match up with their personnel and their skill. Certainly, that's possible. But I would still lean Utah there. Iowa State comes to them, and they're on the road at UCF. So when you really go through it, how many games, when you think about Utah, are legitimately losable? 3, perhaps. Oklahoma State on the road? All right. Yeah, you could talk me into that one. Iowa State at home, I have a hard time thinking that Utah loses that game. Arizona at home, I have a hard time thinking Utah loses that game. At Colorado, I don't think Colorado's quite ready for what Utah is going to have in the trenches. So you really look through the schedule, and I think we could easily fast forward to the end of the year, and Utah sitting there 10-2, 11-1, and en route to a Big 12 title perhaps, and possibly en route to a college football playoff berth. It wouldn't shock me at all, especially when you start to dive in game by game in the schedule. So I think the toughest games are at Oklahoma State, Arizona at home, and then I think you could maybe make a case that at, I don't know, Colorado would be the other one. But man, I would lean Utah in 2 of those 3 at the very least, with that one game at Oklahoma State being the toughest on the schedule. With Kansas State, it's going to be a new look Kansas State. New offensive coordinator, but Avery Johnson, I think, is prepared at the quarterback spot to elevate this offense to a new level. They have a terrific 1-2 punch at running back with Colorado transfer Dylan Edwards and DJ Giddens. I also know that they have to replace 3 players along the offensive line, including Cooper Beebe, which is of significant concern, especially if you're going to lean so heavily on the run game. But you look at the defense, too. They've returned 7 starters. It should be one of the better units in the Big 12. So when you look down the list of Kansas State, they go to Iowa State on the final weekend of the year. That'll be a very tricky game. UT Martin at Tulane. Be careful with that Tulane game, but one that I still think Kansas State will have an advantage. Arizona comes to them at BYU. Be careful with the BYU game, on the road especially. But I think at this point, Kansas State's program is on a little bit more solid footing than BYU, at least at the moment. Oklahoma State is at home. I think they should be in a pretty good spot to at least challenge Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State got them last year. Maybe they get revenge this year on September 28th. October 12th, they're at Colorado. October 19th, they're at West Virginia. West Virginia replaces an awful lot. But they'll be able to run the football, but you have to think that Kansas State will be prepared to slow down the run game that West Virginia will throw at them. Colorado's got great weapons. I don't think they're ready for the line of scrimmage play that Kansas State will present. Kansas is at home on October 26th. They're at Houston. Arizona State, Cincinnati come to them. And like I said, they finish up on the road in Ames against the Cyclones of Iowa State. How many games on that list are really losable? Okay, Oklahoma State, I think that's losable. Kansas, sure, that's losable. It's a rivalry game on October 26th. And they go to Iowa State. I think they might have 3 games that are legitimate losable. Either way, I feel really good about both Kansas State and about Utah. But based on the schedule, I think Utah's schedule is a lot more manageable than Kansas State's. So I would lean in favor of Utah. They're in their first year in the Big 12. Looking at the ACC, you have NC State against Louisville. Both teams, I think, have a chance to make a lot of noise this year. Well, everybody's talking about the big 3 in the ACC. And if you want to extend it to a Virginia Tech, if you want to extend it maybe a little bit beyond, I think you look at the big 3, Miami, Florida State, and what you're going to get with Clemson. When you get beyond them, there's about 4 or 5 teams, NC State and Louisville included, that can be 9-3 or 6-6. I think it's big discrepancy. I think there's a lot of parity there in the middle of the ACC, but these 2 teams are looking for a 9-win regular season. At least that's what Vegas is looking at for them. 8-5 is the win total for both the Wolfpack and the Cardinals. Let's start with NC State. Now, the Wolfpack had one of the biggest offseason signings by bringing in Coastal Carolina transfer Grayson McCall. Now, not a lot of people have really talked about that outside of Raleigh, North Carolina, but that's a significant addition. The guy that's played that much college football, to be able to get him for 1 year is significant. They also added former Ohio State wide receiver Noah Rogers, which at one point was a top 50 prospect in the country coming out of high school. Now, it's going to be hard to overcome the loss of Peyton Wilson. It's arguably the best defensive player in the country last year, but there's a lot of really good players there along the front. There's a lot of really good players, I think, at the second level, but there are a couple questions there in the secondary. I always feel, though, that Dave Doran and Tony Gibson, his defensive coordinator, they're always going to be in a good spot on that side of the ball. So I look at NC State. Let's go through the schedule. Western Carolina's week 1. They'll handle that one. That's on the Thursday. Gives them a couple extra days to prepare for the neutral site game against Tennessee. That game will be in Charlotte. Tennessee will be really, really good. I think North Carolina State's defense will be really, really good. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch, especially if they're a little bit of a question mark, maybe a little bit of a liability in the secondary. That will be an area that I'll be trying to watch in that game for sure. But Tennessee has a slight advantage there. That game is certainly a toss-up. Louisiana Tech, that's a neutral site at Clemson. Very difficult game to go into Death Valley and expect to get a win. Here's where it gets a little bit more manageable for NC State. Northern Illinois, Wake Forest, Syracuse are your next 3 games. I think Northern Illinois is a win. Wake Forest should be a win as well. Syracuse on October 12th, that game is going to be in Raleigh at Carter Finley. They should handle it. But I do think Syracuse has a chance to be quite a bit better there in the ACC. They're at Cal after that. Be careful. Stanford's at home. Duke's at home. They're on the road at Georgia Tech, and they finished the season on the road at North Carolina. Now, they matched up really good against North Carolina the last couple of years. I would think they would in this case as well, but it's still a rivalry game, so we have to put it on the list, at least for the moment. Be careful with the at Georgia Tech game. The game's on the Thursday. You'll have a week off beforehand. Georgia Tech's got great team speed, and I think Georgia Tech can be a very dangerous team in the ACC this year. So I look at, there's really 4 games for me that I think NC State could potentially lose. Tennessee, at Clemson, at Georgia Tech, and then at North Carolina. But right now, based on how things have gone the last couple of years against Drake May, I would think they have a pretty decent advantage over the Tar Heels. Let's go to the ACC runner-up last year. That would be Louisville. Nobody expected, except for us, of course, to see them in the ACC championship game last year, but that's exactly what Jeff Brom did. And you look at what they bring back. I think they have a lockdown corner in Quincy Riley. You have a complete takeover the game difference maker along the defensive line in Ashton Gelati. The defense should be one of the best in the league. Offensively, they went out and got Colin Lacey from South Alabama. That was a huge addition. And they brought in transfer quarterback Tyler Shuck. Now, if Tyler Shuck can stay healthy, which has been a real challenge of his dating back to his time at Oregon and at Texas Tech, he's got a ton of talent. and he might even be an upgrade as far as talent is concerned based on what they had last year. But availability is the most important ability, and he has not been available very often the last couple seasons. Hopefully he'll be back. He'll be at 100%, and he'll complete the season for the Louisville Cardinals. You look at how things start for them. Austin Peay, Jacksonville State should handle both those games out of the gate. Then they get Georgia Tech, tricky game. You know what I've already said about Georgia Tech? I think they're really talented. I think they got a lot of team speed. They're not a team you want to mess around with, but that game will be in Louisville, so I would lean in favor of the Cardinals. Remember, Georgia Tech played them in the opener last year, and that game was really interesting, at least for the first half. And then Louisville came all the way back and somehow pulled off a miraculous comeback. They go to Notre Dame on September 28th. You know Notre Dame's had that one circled, that's for sure. SMU comes to them at Virginia. Miami is at home. Very difficult game there. I think Miami has the most talent in the ACC right now. Will they ultimately be the best team in the ACC? That is a question that we don't know at the moment. They're at Boston College. They're at Clemson on November 2nd. They're at Stanford on November 16th before they finish up with Pitt at home and at Kentucky. You look at the losable games on the schedule. I think the Notre Dame game is definitely a losable game. Miami game at home, very losable game. At Clemson, very losable game. At Kentucky, very losable game. So they're about 4 games that are legitimately losable, I think, for Louisville, at least looking at their preseason schedule. At the moment, I would lean slightly in favor of NC State, but it's a toss-up right now, and part of that toss-up has to do with the fact that Tyler Shuck might miss time at some point or another. If he doesn't, you could very easily make the case for Louisville, but knowing that that's been a question mark up to this point, I'm going to lean slightly in favor of Grayson McCall and the NC State Wolfpack. Finally, last but certainly not least, we will move into the Big Ten. 2 teams that feel very different. At least they did last year. Washington, national runner-up last year. Their win total is at 7.5. So is Iowa, 7.5. One team lit up the scoreboard against everybody last year. One team refuses to allow anyone to light up the scoreboard, including their own offense. Let's start with Washington. Obviously, Michael Penix being gone, all those incredible wide receivers being gone, it's going to be really difficult to replace all those key pieces. Now, they did bring in Will Rogers from Mississippi State, and Demond Williams is a transfer from Arizona, where he was recruited and developed under the new regime. So that competition is ongoing. Neither were super sharp when they were out there in the spring game, but at the same time, it's still very early, I think, in the process of evaluating who's ultimately going to be the guy for the Washington Huskies. Now, Jed Fish, I think, is going to do a good job with the quarterback spot, but I think replacing all the talent off of last year is going to be incredibly difficult, especially knowing, too, that a lot of those players were drafted in the top 30, top 40 picks. I mean, they had a ton of guys go early, and that will be a very difficult thing to replace, and guys that contributed a lot over the last couple of years. But the schedule is manageable, at least early, for the Washington Huskies. Weber State in week 1, Eastern Michigan. Week 2, Washington State. That's the Apple Cup. That'll be in week 3. Very interesting game, of course. You know, Washington State's going to have that one circled. You left us at the altar. We're going now to the Big Ten. You're remaining in the Pac-12. You know that one will mean an awful lot to Washington State, but I don't think at the moment Washington State has quite the horses that they did a year ago or even 2 years ago when Cam Ward was leading the helm there for Washington State. Northwestern's at home. That's a game that should be won. And then you go on the road to Rutgers. Also a very, I think, tricky road trip, but one that I would just think is a bit of a toss-up, but I would lean just ever so slightly in favor of Washington in that one, but that will be a difficult game. Michigan then comes to you. You're at Iowa. You're at Indiana on October 26th. SC comes to you. You're at Penn State. UCLA's at home. Then you're on the road at Oregon in the final week of the regular season. You go through the list. I think the Rutgers game is losable for sure. Michigan, we already know what that game looked like just a few months ago. We know that that's going to be a challenging one for the Washington Huskies. At Iowa, 2 very different programs. We're comparing them right now, but 2 very different programs. This game's on the road at Iowa, so that is obviously a losable game. I think at Indiana is one that they should win. USC at home, that'll be a toss-up for sure. At Penn State, that'll be a very difficult game, one that I'd lean in favor of Penn State, at least at the moment. UCLA's at home. I think they'll handle that one. And then they're at Oregon. I would lean in favor of Oregon, at least at the moment. So I have 6 games right now that I think are legitimately losable for the Washington Huskies. That's a lot, especially considering they went 14-1 last season. Moving on to the Iowa Hawkeyes. Now, a lot to look at. Now, a lot of the names are the same, there is one significant new piece on this offensive team for the Hawkeyes. That would be Tim Lester, former Western Michigan head coach. He's hired in the offseason to replace the former offensive coordinator Brian Ferentz. After a long coaching search, they landed on Tim Lester, but we're all curious. I mean, you watch the spring game, they're not going to show anything, but did look like there was maybe a few wrinkles that we're not so used to, including a majority of the snaps, or maybe not a majority, but a vast number, a significant increase in snaps that we've seen in shotgun. So either way, I think the offense is going to be a lot better. Defensively, they're going to be Iowa. You know they're going to be just fine there. But how much better can the offense be? They've been in the hundreds for as long as I can remember. Can they get to the 80s, 70s, 60s? If they can, then who knows how things might end up. But you look at the schedule, and I think it's fairly manageable for the Hawkeyes. Illinois State week 1, Iowa State week 2. Iowa State, very tricky game. Always a difficult one, but one that Iowa has played pretty well in, at least in recent years. Troy week 3, be careful there, but Troy replaces an awful lot. I don't know if they'll have quite the pieces to be able to contend there in week 3 in Iowa City. Then they go to Minnesota. That's a game I would lean heavily in favor of Iowa right now, even though Minnesota, that game will be on the road. It won't be a slam dunk, but one that I would definitely favor the Hawkeyes in at the moment. At Ohio State, that'll be a loss. Washington at home, that one's a toss-up for sure. On the road at Michigan State, anybody's guess as to how Jonathan Smith's going to do in year 1. The fact that it's on the road makes me think it's a lot more difficult naturally, but either way, that's probably a game that is certainly losable. Northwestern at home, Wisconsin at home, difficult game against Wisconsin. At UCLA, I would lean in favor of Iowa there. At Maryland, that'll be a tricky game. And then finally, Nebraska at home there in the final game of the regular season. So what do we get to? About 6 games that are certainly losable for Iowa right now. At Ohio State, Washington at home, at Michigan State, Wisconsin at home, at Maryland, and at Nebraska, and then Nebraska, in the final week of the season. That game will be at home. Right now, if I had to pick between one or the other, I would lean Iowa. They're more familiar with the league. And I think their ability to slow the game down with an improved offensive attack, not going to be an aggressive offense. It's not who they are. That's not what they believe in. But I do think they'll be better on that side of the ball. They certainly can't be worse. I think their familiarity with the league and understanding what it takes to win in the league and the line of scrimmage play that is elevated in the Big Ten makes me lean Iowa, at least here in 2024. As always, we love to interact with you guys, so continue, please, to send in questions to our mailbag at alwayscollegefootball@gmail.com. You can also submit questions on our social media at alwayscfb on both Instagram and on Twitter. So we're starting to get to those now a little bit more frequently. So please submit those because we want to take the show where you guys want the show to go. And your help in that manner can really help us here as we move into the summer months. So let's start with Stan in Texas. Coobs, what's he got for us?
All right. After the announcement on Game Day, he says, it was announced that Game Day will be in College Station when they play Notre Dame, and the game will be in prime time. My question is, who's under more pressure to win the game? The first-year head coach who has a starving fan base, or a third-year head coach with playoff expectations?
I don't even think it's close. I think by a mile it's Notre Dame. I think you look at Notre Dame, this is the year, right? This is the year that Marcus Freeman is circled. You bring in a highly touted prospect at quarterback. You have a new offensive coordinator, Mike Denbrock. You finally talked all offseason about the improved play at the wide receiver spot. I think the defense has a chance to be one of the best in the country. I think the secondary is arguably the best in the country. The linebackers shouldn't miss a beat, and they have 2 of the best defensive tackles in the country as well. So you look just at what they have back, and I think everything is lined up for Notre Dame this year to make a run. Now, with all that being said, being on the road in Texas, I think it's a blessing this game was designated for prime time, because if this game was at 2:30, there in College Station, Texas on August 31st, it's going to be 5,000 degrees. So the fact that it was in prime time was a significant benefit to Notre Dame. But either way, I don't think Mike Elko right now is expected to do a whole lot in year 1. Now, I happen to think they're a very dangerous team this year. Now, not picking them to make the playoff, not picking them to, challenge for the SEC championship, but I would be shocked if A&M didn't knock off a contender this year. I really would. I think they're going to beat someone that you don't expect them to beat. That's what you can expect from Mike Elko. His team's punched up at Duke, and I think they'll punch up at Texas A&M as well. I think this is a must-win for Marcus Freeman. I think back to all the negativity surrounding the program a couple years ago when he took over, lost the bowl game in his first game as the head coach, lost the first 2 games, including a game against Marshall. There's a lot of negativity at that point. I think it could boil over in the event in which they don't win on the road at A&M against a team that doesn't have significant expectations. So the pressure, without question, is on the Irish and on Marcus Freeman in particular.
All right, next question comes from Kevin in North Carolina, and he asks, do you think it's a good or bad idea that they are talking about eliminating walk-ons in college football?
Well, I haven't heard a whole lot of buzz about this, by the way. So wherever it is that you're hearing this, Kevin, I don't know how much traction there is. Walk-ons are an essential part of putting a program together. Guys that are either from the area or had ties to the school and a willingness to go and accept an opportunity to play at a place without a scholarship is something that I don't ever want to see getting rid of. Now, I will also say that I do think walk-ons can be, I think it kind of tilts the deck, frankly, especially in the NIL era, because you now pay a walk-on NIL money to compensate for the loss of scholarship. And maybe in some cases, the walk-on won't even break even, but they'll actually exceed what the break-even mark might be. So I do think at some programs with deep NIL pockets, you can have a significant advantage with the type of player that you can attract as a walk-on. But at the end of the day, man, guys are not often turning down scholarship opportunities at the Power 5 level to walk on at the Power 5 level. Now, guys might turn down an FCS opportunity to walk on to the Power 5 level or a G5 opportunity to walk on the Power 5 level, but it's not often you're seeing guys spurn one level for the next level when they're on the same level. So I think walk-ons can, in some cases, really, it's kind of a cheat code. I think back to like Nebraska back in the day. How many walk-ons did they have? Like 40, 50, 60 walk-ons that was so beneficial. And they just had the deepest roster possible. And guys that would get scholarship elsewhere just wanted to play at Nebraska, so they'd go to Nebraska. So I do think that in some cases it can be a significant advantage, but I don't ever want to see walk-ons get rid of them. They're too important to the fabric of college football.
All right, next question comes from Sue in Michigan. And she asks, being a Michigan fan, what are the chances that Michigan will be playing football games on Thursdays, Fridays, and possibly on Wednesdays? I hope they stay on Saturdays. I think you will lose a lot of support going to days other than Saturday.
Well, I haven't seen anything about Michigan potentially playing games on Wednesdays. Now, with the new Big Ten schedule and how they're kind of setting things up, the possibility is real that you could play Friday night games. The possibility has always existed that you could play Thursday night games. And then you always know that Saturday is the day for college football. I don't think we're going to start seeing a lot of movement for Michigan. Maybe one game a year, perhaps. Could you see that game on a Friday night? Maybe. But I don't think Fox, CBS, and NBC are going to be in a huge hurry to try to go capture a Friday night audience with the Michigan Wolverines, because Michigan moves the needle. Even if they're up against some of the biggest programs in the sport, they're still going to move the needle on Saturdays. So you could put Michigan against fill-in-the-blank university in the noon window on Fox. That game's going to rate like crazy, regardless. Now, if you're one of the other schools that might need an unoccupied window to boost your rating, those are the teams that I would anticipate seeing on a Thursday and on a Friday. Like I think back to 2008, 2009, Boise State elevated their program because they played in a non-competitive window on Friday nights. People watched Boise State as a result. Friday night football, I watched it every single week. I watched Boise State. I watched Colin Kaepernick in Nevada. I watched those teams on Friday nights. And it was really beneficial to those programs because they needed that window. Because if you put them at noon on Saturday, up against Ohio State, up against Bama, up against Georgia, up against Florida, up against Michigan, those games are going to get lost in the weeds as far as television viewership is concerned. So if I were Michigan, I wouldn't be too worried about it. But if I were a fan of, say, Indiana, then I might want that Thursday night window so there's more eyeballs on my program. I might want that Friday night window so there's more eyeballs on my program. But if you're a blue blood, the likelihood of you moving off the traditional day that is Saturday is probably a little bit smaller. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get your show, and we appreciate all of you. We've seen the ratings flowing in these last couple of weeks. It's like people are fed up with the fact that one particular fan base left us a lot of one-star ratings because their team didn't get in the playoff. It's not the show's fault. We were 5 stars before the playoff committee put their rankings out. Now we're down to 3.6, but we see you guys pushing back because one particular fan base cannot weigh down the work that we're doing on behalf of all college football fans. So we appreciate all of you for going out on the offensive and helping lift up the show the best you can. You can also help the show by sharing the show with your friends, sharing the show with your family, talking about the show on whatever message board you're on. All that would be terrific. So we really appreciate all of you for supporting the show the way you have here throughout this offseason. So for all of us here at Always College Football, for Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an incredible day, and remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.